Hello and welcome to another SDA Q&A. I am your host for today. My two very special guests are Dr. Maury Jackson and Nathan Brown. Great to have you here with me today, guys.
Morning, sir.
Good morning. Great to be here. Thank you so much.
Now, Maury, you and I have had an interview before in season 2. If people wanted to look it up, it's number 56. And I'm guessing it's a couple of years ago now. I think we were in the throes of lockdown, and the whole series was about Glacier View and the impact and the build up to it and what went on, and I really enjoyed my interview with you back then. And,
I enjoyed it too. Thank you, Peter. It was wonderful.
Fun. I watched it again this week, and just to refresh my memory on the conversation. And Nathan, you've been on the podcast. Is this your third or fourth time now?
I've lost count, or I haven't been keeping score. But it's been a few times, and it's always fun to have a chat.
It's always fun. Love having you on. We've known each other a long time, and always love your work and your creativity.
And of course, part of our reason for being here is because there's a connection to the fact that we're here talking to each other
tell us a little bit
to
about
that conversation.
Tell us about that, because I noticed that when we were talking about what to say in the promo, and you actually said, well, you tell us what happened.
Well, it's a little bit like when you've done your shows around Australia and you take credit for these various relationships that you've been responsible for forming.
That's right.
This is one of these, just in a slightly different way. So it's more than 2 years ago since you talked to Maury, because that was the genesis for our connection that led to a conversation that led to this book. I'd kind of been having conversations on the topic of race and racism with Kendra Holoviak-Valentine, a mutual friend of many of us, and she had, in those contexts, said, you need to talk to Maury Jackson sometime. And so when I saw him pop up on, he's going to be one of our guests on SDAQ&A, I said, I need to make sure I watch that one. Just do a little bit of, behind the scenes, checking out of who this Jackson guy is. And it particularly caught my attention in the context of that conversation where you talked about Maury's doctoral dissertation, which brought together social justice and Adventist publishing. And as someone who kind of has a keen interest in both those fields, it just seemed that I should check that out. So I got in touch. I got back to Kendra and said, can you give me an email address for Maury? And my first question to Maury is, can I read your dissertation? Which, that's a good pickup line anytime.
Straight in.
And so dissertations are kind of weird things, but particularly to read them as your introduction to somebody that you might work with. And so
part of the reason they're weird is that you're writing for an audience of 3.
That's right. That's right.
So you would have been thrilled when Nathan gave you a call then.
Yeah, exactly. The audience went up by a quarter almost.
So I actually did read Maury's dissertation and found it interesting, and but I kind of had said I'm going to read this before we have a conversation, so that I've done I've earned the right to have the conversation because I've put in the hard yards of reading his dissertation. And so then we made a time for a Zoom chat, and we started talking about various aspects of his topic. And also, of course, you need to put this back in the context of the second half of 2020 and what had happened in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and the racism, Black Lives Matter protests that happened right around the world. And, in that context, we're sort of saying, well, where are the Adventist voices in this conversation? Because both of us believe that we have meaningful things to say and even things to contribute that might be unique or helpful in some of those discussions. And that even fitted with what Maury had worked on in his dissertation. And so that was the beginning of this project. And so 2 years later, a little bit more than 2 years later, because I look back and it was in October 2020 that we sent out the first invitations to people to contribute to this book project. And 2 years later, we've got a book. So, Peter, it's a book inspired by, or sparked by SDAQ&A.
I love it.
So this is the SDAQ&A book launch.
Yes,
I didn't see in the forward or acknowledgements my name mentioned.
Yeah. We're acknowledging it here. We're doing that publicly right now.
Thank you very much.
So that's why we came back here, and this is one of the first interviews that will be aired about it. So yeah, you've got an exclusive there.
I love being one of the first. I like that kind of temperate exclusive nature.
Well, we've done an interview, but it hasn't been publicly released yet. So it's the first public.
First splash. Well, I was very excited to get my copy because I think even Maury, I'm not sure if we talked about it in the interview, but I know we definitely chatted about it after or before, where I think I even said I'd love to get you back on to talk specifically about this kind of topic, and it's been one that I've been yearning to find out what Adventists have got to say about it. So I'm excited to be able to help promote the book and to chat about it with you guys today. You've pretty much
you got a free book, Peter.
Oh, look, I appreciate it.
So you've been acknowledged.
Can I get the rights? Yeah, can I get the rights to do the audiobook of it?
And Peter, in the spirit of your program here, the foreword is also by a former Adventist who gives us a look from the outside in.
Oh, really?
Reverend Dr. Matthew Burdett. He was a former student of mine in undergrad and graduate. He's now a priest in the Anglican tradition, and he's a book editor himself, actually, at Convergent Books, which is the religious publishing of Penguin Random House. But I think that's important because the Adventist Christian Communion is better helped when we have voices that will converse with us and grow us and have sympathetic ear to our own development of ideas. And I just thought it's important to say that, and thank you for what you
I like that you said that, because one of my the things I really enjoy is hearing a wide variety of voices from inside, outside. I think it's important to value everyone's voice if they're interested in a specific topic, because it's from hearing the voices from the many perspectives that you actually gain a better understanding of the whole issue. Right. So it's good that you highlighted that.
There is also a pattern to the book which begins with that, but that ends with the afterword from Dr. John Webster, where he actually takes the example and unpacks the example of the church speaking to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and speaking in a public way from a uniquely, distinctly Adventist perspective to talk about the issues of racism in a very specific context, historical context in that way. And so I kind of think that almost there's this pattern where people speak into us, we have a conversation amongst ourselves, we listen, and then we can speak into the wider world. And I think that's something that we're trying to model, is that when we, and I'm talking we as the Adventist community, when we listen to the world around us, when we hear the questions, the needs, the issues that are important to the world around us, we reflect on them, and then we can actually contribute something back. But we can only do that meaningfully if we've already done the work of listening.
Yes.
And I think that's a very significant, there is that kind of pattern to the book, which is not unintentional.
That's great. And I think one of the reasons why I haven't broached the topic on the show is because I felt very ignorant about it, and I have felt that there's not been much material to be able to for me to have researched and draw upon. So this is a real conversation starter, and it's like listening by reading. So look, I was going to read the back, but we've pretty much covered what the book is about and aimed the reasons you've put it together, how Adventist faith responds to race and racism. And Adventism has had a kind of a strange tension and ebb and flow with regards to this topic. Did you find in pulling together the different authors and the conversations in the book, the material in the book, that there was much of a nod to the thread of Adventist history and how Adventism has historically processed this topic?
Can I say a couple of things? Not only has Adventism had an interesting relationship, but the American tradition has. The American tradition has entered this conversation as a black-white matter. And one of the things that Nathan and I wanted to do is say a topic like this is one that really, it's not for a solo author. It's not for a binary discourse. It's for a larger discourse. So what we did is we made certain we had contributors from Africa, Asia, North and South America, Australia, Europe, and the islands of the seas. We wanted it to be a broad discourse. We also wanted it to be a discourse, that focused on the union level tertiary institutions as contributors, so that those who are actually dealing with matters of social engagement between different ethnicities, different races, tribalism, casteism, that they would be the voices to help us think through the relationship that our tradition can draw out of it. So I know I didn't directly hit the question, but I think it's important to know that it's not just an Adventist problem with looking into their tradition. It's actually a problem uniquely arranged in different contexts that need broader voices to give us some insight.
Yeah, that's a good point.
In the context of Adventist history, there's a sequence of chapters around the middle of the book that actually very specifically address that kind of aspect of this. The first one, I think it is, the first one's from Matthew Corkman, who I notice his comment, and it's good to have you listening, Matt. We very much appreciate your contribution to this book, where he draws on the best of Ellen White as far as her contribution to what he would call prototypical black theology, which of course developed many years after she wrote, but he kind of identifies some of the antecedents or the early echoes of some of those things in her writing, and particularly her attitude to working in the American South. But then we have an article from Michael Campbell, author of 1919 and 1922, almost the missing chapter from his 1922 book, where he talks about how Adventism, in its drift into fundamentalism in the 1920s and 30s, followed a lot of the social aspects of the turn towards fundamentalism as well, which included the loss of gender inclusivity and the loss of racial inclusivity. And that a lot of our 20th century American issues with race and racism actually developed at that time. As we became more fundamentalist, we became less socially inclusive as well. And so there's a real link there and he builds that link with some of the racial issues in 20th century Adventism. And then the third one, I think, is Kendra Holoviak-Valentine's chapter, where she talks about this, the call to, and she very much even identifies writing in the context of the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, that this is present truth for Adventism, and certainly something that we should be speaking on and to today. So I think there's very much that kind of string of Adventist history and where that fits there. Of course, each of those draw on some of the earlier Adventist history in making their case, and then take that progression further, and as in Kendra's chapter, gets to today.
Yeah, I also think Herma Percy and Mark Carr helped to take the contemporary voices of what you might hear in congregational context, potluck discussions, and Herma Percy lifts those voices up, but I think Mark Carr gives a heuristic by saying, let's think of narrative theology and just think of how we can take this oral tradition serious enough to do our own theological reflection about it. So it's not just in the past, but it's also in our current context that we try to do some justice to. And I want to say, I appreciate the language that Nathan said. And Nathan, I'm gonna let a little of our back talk show, and you're gonna be the better for it, and I'm gonna be the worse for it. But that's all right. That's the way I want it to be, because Nathan said these words: the best of Ellen White and her tradition, and that is true. She has some things we can celebrate. But I can tell you, just from my own conversations in North America, more and more Black Adventists are dismissing her, not because they want to, but because they don't see a laying out of the complexity that there's the best in her, but there's the not so best, right? And there are these statements that she makes to endorse the segregation of worship. And I have family members who walked away after that. They said, no, that's not right. And often the apologist of Ellen White will kind of look at Booker T. Washington and what he was saying at the time and say she wasn't saying anything different from him. But Black scholars know that there was also W.E.B. Du Bois, and they would say Booker Washington was the first Black leader chosen by white people in America. So Du Bois was arguing for integration, Washington for a kind of accommodation. Ellen White actually sided with Washington, and that's not her most noble. But I appreciate that Cortman brought out the better elements. And I can tell you, I had someone call me who I didn't even haven't talked with in a while, who had got a hold of the book, and they said, you know what? He has given me a reason to maybe not be as harsh toward Ellen White, because there is that element. So I think, on the one hand, by not lifting up the complexity, sometimes others will walk away. He brought up the noble part that helped some who are aware of the other aspects say, all right, I'll give a better hearing or a more fair hearing. And Nathan was clear that, we had to be careful. We had to walk that line carefully because we have an audience that in many places revere, what Ellen White has to say.
Yeah, I think it's, and I noticed that in our conversation in our previous interview, Maury, we discussed a little bit about Ellen White and the more nuanced kind of view and how important it is not to hide or gloss over. We're all human. We all make mistakes, and we can all look. I'd hate for people to quote things I've said even a year ago and use that against me when I'm dead and gone. But it's important to still lay both on the table, not try and hide, and to be able to say, well, here's some good things that were said as well.
It's almost as if maybe the very prophetic witness she has is a witness to the fact that we all can grow.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Because if you only looked at the less positive, I can see why you said some of your family just walked away. And sometimes it's hard to even take it in context, but at other times there are quite bold moves that she made for the justice in that area.
Yeah. And Cortland lifts them up and puts them right side by side with James Cone, the real kind of systematizing father of Black theology. And I thought he did an excellent job.
I will bring up another question that Matthew has just written there. I'll bring it up onto the screen. I'd like to remind you that the original paper had an extra 1,000 words on her darker side that had to be cut for word count of the book project. It wasn't, and I'm sure, yeah, and I think that's the point you're making too. You're honoring that Matthew isn't trying to deify. This is just these are the facts, and here's the good and the bad, and let's look at the nuanced view of it. But I think in doing so, perhaps what you're both wanting to do is to also not tear down the house of cards and try and focus on what remains and what is good and how we can move forward.
Right.
Well, the other thing is that this project wasn't a book about Ellen White, and there's other places to have that discussion. What I'm looking for in putting this project together is what are the resources we can draw on to actually respond meaningfully and faithfully and well on the topics and urgent questions of race and racism. And so one of the things I didn't want to set up was necessarily a dichotomy, which would be a false dichotomy, that you can either believe in Ellen White or you work for anti-racism. That you can't have Ellen White and, if your choice is to be racist or not, and Ellen White or not, most Adventists would choose Ellen White.
Right.
And that's a really disturbing and unhealthy thing. But I didn't want to try and push anybody into that corner. And so let's draw on the best of our tradition. That's another topic that's another discussion for another day. But let's draw on what we can take and even share with the world when we find. There was something I wrote a few years ago in our book Do Justice, where I talked about the echoes between some of Ellen White's statements about us all being woven together in the web of humanity. That is almost directly echoed by statements of Martin Luther King Jr. And not that I see that there's probably any overlap between those two, except that in making those statements, both of them were trying to follow Jesus and serve a God who created us all in God's image. And that when we recognize those echoes, they kind of reinforce each other as these are the important things that we should be focusing on. And so that becomes an opportunity for us to find common ground with others in our communities who might be activists on anti-racism, might be concerned with these issues, and that, hey, we've got this thing in our tradition that actually encourages and motivates and inspires me to work with you, and may even be a resource that we could share with you in doing the best we can for the well-being of humanity and to actually address these urgent questions in our community, in our society.
Yeah, exactly. And like you were saying there about creating these dichotomies, these false choices that people think you are presenting. Like if I say I don't like Hillary Clinton's politics, it doesn't mean I like Trump's. But people often make, oh, well, if you don't like this, that means you've got to, you must support that. And what the great thing I've been gaining from my quarter read through it is this sense of the willingness to be open. This is the good, the bad, but the general thrust of it is how can we move forward? How can we create dialogue together to not bury the past or hide the past, but to live with it, bear the scars, but to move forward in a constructive way. And there's two reasons I haven't done an interview, and this is the first one. I mentioned my ignorance to it. It's not an ignorance from not trying. It's an ignorance to really not being able to keep up with the fast changes that are going on. And secondly, for strange kind of judgments that can be thrown at you for speaking on this topic. And I found that if you look like I think, Maury, we may have chatted about this again off air or in the interview, I'm not sure, how in the cafeteria in the 60s at the GC, there was segregation, um, and how terrible that was, but how far we have come in this time. But I've noticed in recent time almost a backlash um, for what to see. These are the kind of things I didn't want to have to get into, but for
So
being white, for being male, for being part of the patriarchy, and yet, in my humble opinion, I've felt like for the last 60, 70 years, the progress forward has been people trying to stand side by side. But as the powers have shifted, there's a bit of a backlash now, and I'm kind of alluding to some things that I wonder if you guys could talk to. And that's why I was excited about this book, because that's not coming through in this book. It's coming through in, look, we're in this together. Can we work through this together so that we have a better place on the other side for our kids? We want the polarizing to stop.
Yeah, I'd like to say something. Matthew Burdett really helped to bring this out on a panel that we missed Nathan because he had to go back, but we went on ahead with the Adventist Society of Religious Studies. We had a panel on this, and Matthew Burdett actually brought up that he said, in the room right now, who would be the outsider? Now he's speaking to scholars of religion. He said, the Trump supporter. And the question we have to ask is, how do we engage with this person, right? So I get the sensibility there, Peter, right? How do we have serious, honest engagement about sensitive topics?
Yeah.
And one of the points I made is that I've been blessed in the faculty of the Divinity School at La Sierra University. I think you develop the skill to do it if you have that conversation more and more. The less you have the conversation, the less you feel the skill in it, and the more frightened you are to start that journey. So a part of this is to help us understand there are safe spaces to make mistakes in how we articulate things.
Right.
One of the points we talked about is we didn't define race and racism and anti-racism and then say write on it, given these definitions. We said write on it. And then when we saw, there's complexity in how these authors are seeing this. They don't see it all the same. There's overlap. There's nuance. There might be areas in which this claim is incommensurable with another claim, even though they have space of overlap. And we use that to then say, here's a working definition for us as a community to walk through. Is that helpful there?
Oh, very helpful. And I really appreciate the undertone there of inclusivity that you're offering to people like me that are that have got lots to say and thoughts I have on it, but I'm too fearful to speak up in case I say it wrong.
Right.
And I noticed that in season 3, and Nathan was on one of our conversations where there was a panel where we were talking about LGBT plus community, and I felt a similar kind of feeling there, where it was so easy to say something wrong, even though myself and others are incredibly interested in creating a table that offers an invitation for people to be at it. So thank you for saying what you said there, because it makes me feel like, okay, I can say some stuff and we can have conversation. I can learn and grow. And
an example, I saw one of the comments were about the Apostle Paul, right? And his the question was, did Paul support slavery by saying to the slave to stay with his master, or is it more complex? And I would say, actually, it is more complex with Paul. Now, I'm not saying everything the Apostle Paul said. I think he didn't have areas to grow, because at first he said John Mark can't be with me, and at the end of his life, hey, please bring John Mark, right? So Paul grew too. But I think we ought to take his letter to Philemon with a little more nuance. Some scholars are saying really what Paul was doing, he doesn't it's not so much about Onesimus, go live with your master. It's about Onesimus, go to your master and remind him the debt he owes me is his entire life, and I'm ready to take the payment, because I'm going to make him do something in that community that will so socially up in the system of slavery, he will be persona non grata of the masters, because they were supposed to kill slaves who ran away. And now if one comes and he's not killed, nor is he a slave, but he's a brother, that is going to disturb the social order. And that's what Paul was aiming at, right? So, I mean, there are ways in which we could read these passages, and we can read them to maybe feel that, well, you know, and this was, and I'm not saying that the questioner is making this point, but if you read the dialogue of slavery in the antebellum South among theologians, you know, you have some very sophisticated interpretations of scripture and theological reflections that defend the institution based on scripture. And I would say it's not as if there was not enough scriptural data that could be resourced. And that's the point we were trying to ask. What can we resource in our tradition, the complex tradition we have as Adventists, that can help in an anti-racism movement? There's going to be resources for something else as well.
And I think that's why it's important that you had this multi-authored, edited, of course, by you and Nathan, but to have multiple authors, I think, was a really important move. If it had just been the two of you, I think it would have been a great book. But I think by having a heap of other people contribute, it makes this sense of, hey, let's get these resources from a wide variety of places, put them on the table, and let's move forward. Let's try and take what we can.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Maury and I have had that conversation, and, you know, we see that we could have written the book between us, but it would have been a much narrower book. It might have been a better book as a work of literature, because we could have been more focused and tighter and all of those kind of things. But for a topic like this, for a topic this important, it needs to be messy. It needs to have diverse views. It needs to have diverse experiences. And I would say that, you know, there's 20 primary contributors to this book. There's also a lot more contributors to this book. There's the, you know, even on the epigraph page, we've got James Baldwin and James Cone and the prophet Isaiah, 3 prophets together on the same page. If someone picks up this book, reads a couple of chapters, and then goes and reads James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree, I'm fine. That's a great outcome, because we're also trying to introduce a broader sweep of you know, theological thinking that actually that we hope this book is a part of. And, you know, whether that is, you know, James Cone, certainly someone that many of our contributors would have referenced. You know, The Cross and the Lynching Tree is one of the, you know, most significant texts of recent theological history, I would say, and is one of those things that makes it changed how I see my faith, and it changed how I understand salvation and the gospel, and it changes how you look at the crucifixion of Jesus, and it changes how you then look at the world around you and the situation of people who are different from me, who I don't have that experience of, but that even now, because I understand the crucifixion of Jesus, I can have greater empathy towards others in the world around me who have different life experiences and who life treats them so unjustly and cruelly and unfairly. And so that's, you know, that's what we're trying to do. Is there's 20 people here, and then there's 200 more. You know, there's a long list of citations on references on the end of every chapter. If someone picks up one of those books and goes and reads them, I think then we've achieved what we've set out to do, because it's a whole there are bigger things going on here than even just the 20 people that we've included in. And of course, one of the early feedback we've had has been quite a few people that saying, "Oh, I wish you had invited me to write a chapter as well." and of course we could have, and maybe there's a second volume in all of that. But as I said to Maury a few times, at points you've just got to put a covers around something and call it a book, because it can grow forever, and everybody's got a new experience and a new perspective to bring. And so that's we don't have to apologize for people we didn't invite to include, but we recognize that there's much more to the conversation beyond what's between the covers of this book.
Yeah. I mean, it can lead to something like a podcast, where you could have House on Fire podcast and you just interview the people you've done already, and then keep it going and keep interviewing people. And
we're working on those ideas.
Yeah, website, blog, compete with A Today and Spectrum, and set up website. Because you're right, it's about the ongoing conversation and the contribution of the many.
And also the diversity amongst them. Like, as Maury said, we were quite proud of the fact we had people that at least some sense represent every inhabited content of the world. Not too many Antarcticans chipping in, but we've got our gaps. The other thing we are very conscious of is
their
that
problems are too big to deal with the question raised.
That's right. That's our book on climate change and creation care. That's a whole other thing.
Another topic I don't want to broach too swiftly.
Well, I seriously think we need to. And I mean, Greg Honus in his chapter in this book actually does move us in that direction about the link between the racialized view of the world and the exploitation of certain races by others, and the exploitation of the natural world. And that's such a significant thing that we need to spend some more time thinking about. His chapter is another just good introduction to get us thinking in that direction. But there's a whole other book in that. And, we have talked about whether there's other projects that we can be working on in that way. But the other thing we were very conscious of in putting this book together was gender diversity as well. And it has been commented by a few that most theological books, unless they're specifically women's focused, don't have the number, 7 out of 20 contributors as female contributors. We were intentional about that. We need those voices, we need those other voices and experiences as a part of having a meaningful conversation in that way as well. So that was, we were trying to keep that focus in what we were doing too.
Yeah, sometimes there's room for equity rather than just equal opportunity.
Yeah.
Right.
And you have to be discerning about that, don't you? Because sometimes it's not a good idea. Sometimes you are better just to go for equal opportunity and just get the best people for the job. But in other areas, it's actually important to seek out equal representation.
Well, we got great people and great chapters, but we also were very conscious that, this matters as far as hearing those different voices and experiences.
I've been, and I do not recommend people watch this series. Perhaps I shouldn't even say it. It's a series that involves people from the Nordic realm, and it's looking at a historical era around 800 AD and the involvement of these Norse folk and the battles and warring between the English, the French, the Arab kingdoms, and now it's getting into Russia and China. And I tell you what, that era, and that's my point, that era of history where slavery abounded, corruption, the rulers and the kings wrote the history they wanted. They just killed and wiped out whole entire families who blinked the wrong way towards them. We have moved to a more civilized focus and an improved way of collectively getting on as community and running governments and systems. And I think it's important to keep that in mind as well, that we could easily revert back to a darker time if we polarize, and if we go, okay, we've got the power now, we're going to just wipe out all the people just because of their nationality or where they've come from. And again, that's another reason why I really like the book, is it's an attempt to go, what I liked what Maury said, the resources, the good things we've got that we can use and collate and bring together to move forward. As I see my 10-year-old daughter coming into the world, I have a heightened sense of wanting it to be a safe space for her to be, to live. Maury, with that kind of backdrop there, did you find, and is the terminology correct to say Black Adventists? Like, is that kind of accurate?
Well, I'll tell you, among Black people, they have as much dispute about terminology as
That's right.
I have cousins who they do not consider themselves African American. They consider themselves Black people. All right.
Yeah.
And I have cousins who consider themselves African American.
Yeah.
This discussion is just a living discussion. It speaks to your issue about the sensitivity, right?
Yes.
But yeah, no.
And it also shows naivety, and a desire not to be naive. I had just a quick aside, I had an interesting luncheon the other day, and there was a couple there in their late 80s, another couple in their 70s, a couple in their 60s, and then a young millennial couple. And we were all just sitting and chatting. And it was interesting how the different couples spoke to each other. And right in front of me, I could hear the older guy say to us, "Hey, you're talking too much, honey." And then right down to more inclusive and, "Hey, honey, if you didn't mind." And there was just an interesting, we didn't even say honey because that was kind of a put down. But it was interesting, just the subtle nuances that we can contribute to conversation because of this naivety to the bigger picture. And to learn, you almost have to reveal some of that underbelly of your faults and flaws in moving forward. And that's why, thanks for answering that question, because I want to learn about correct terminology as I progress and learn more about this topic. So was the Black Adventist community in your studies at the time of the segregation at the GC in the cafeteria, were they talking about it then? This is unfair. Who do these guys think they are? And as time moved forward, and by the time the 80s comes and segregation's gone, was the resentment looking back? What were the feelings that the Black community in the Adventist realm like behind the scenes?
I would say this. So my scholarship in Black church studies is not that deep in Black Adventist church studies, although I do know a lot about it. But what I think I can safely say is, in the Adventist tradition, Black Christianity is as much connected to the non-Adventist Black Christian church as it is to the Adventist church.
Yes, interesting.
So there's no way that they would not have been pushing at the moment that they did. I went to Oakwood College for a few years before finishing at La Sierra University. And no, without a doubt, there's this sensibility, always been this sensibility that Black Adventism has two parents, the Millerite movement on the one hand and slave religion on the other. And they hold to both parents closely,
right,
even to this day. Right. So they would have been conscious and aware. I think that generational discussion you just had, that observation you just made can be made about Black Adventists today. Younger Black Adventists are less committed to the Adventist tradition as they are to Black Christianity. Right. And unless we do better in a conversation of how we can, and in fact, this is a subtext of this book. And you see it in the introduction. Adventism has grown numerically. The question is, has it grown maturationally? It's one thing to grow big, it's another to grow up.
Yes, very
And
good point.
and if we have grown up, and this book takes the premise that at least there's enough of us who have that can help the maturation process, then we should not only be thinking internally, but we should be a pastoral congregation to the entire world to help them to know how to live better in community.
Mm. Like for me personally, one of the reasons I left is that I saw this looping, particularly with equality for men and women, not just women's ordination. I saw it looping, and I had a conversation with someone the other day, that the conversation I was having with him was the exact conversation I had with him in 1981. And he was like, "Yeah, you're right." And so Adventism not only doesn't not mature, it tends to loop, and a very micro loop. Jesus is coming soon. Oh, let's quick put this out, but not really put a lot of effort into truly bringing about social change, community change, pastoral care within the church itself, fostering nurture with its members. So I lost my faith in the church's ability to bring about these kind of changes effectively because of this lack of maturation that you're speaking to. What gives you both a sense of positivity that you're hoping for a different outcome?
I'd like, Nathan, I've been talking a lot, but if you don't mind, I'm going to jump in. As you say that, Peter, I think of the time as a 19-year-old. I said, hey, look, I had my first cousin. She was Roman Catholic. She is Roman Catholic to this day. And I wanted to really convince her about Adventism. She was a student at Syracuse University, getting her degree. And I brought her to one of our bookstores. And I remember I'm showing her these books, and now she's a student at Syracuse University. And she's looking at the books, and I'm getting excited that she's, taking on a serious tone of our books. And she turned to me and said, why are all the books talking about the same thing? The beast, the Sabbath, and something in me, it was like a slap in the face, a wake-up call. This goes to your looping, right? This sense that, wait a minute, yeah, we're just talking about the same things. And what gives me hope is maybe everywhere, but not science publishing. Because this is a topic the world is engaged with, and we're trying to help do theological reflection on this topic as Adventist Christians. And I'll tell you, I've always been more hopeful, but maybe because I teach the younger generation. But when Nathan contacted me, I was like, this is exciting. And I have to say, I was thinking to myself, I'm wondering if this is going to be another one of those invites where I write something and it's just sitting in my computer because it'll never get published.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I give bold kudos to science publishing for the courage that it takes to say our theological reflection is something we can do, not just on favorite topics, but on the real lived experience of the world. And we have something to say. And I have more faith now than ever before.
That kind of thing excites me, and I think it's a really valuable observation and feeling to note that these exciting things suddenly seem to have legs. My discouragement came when I realized that after 30, 40 years of observing, I'm kind of I had the pleasure of being able to do music with the Adventist Church and travel around a lot and just see lots of different communities. But Adventists are good at giving you this sense of excitement that something's about to change, something's about to happen. And I suddenly realized that it was really false hope that I was offered, and that Adventist leadership, particularly in the younger leaders, are great at inspiring the even younger upcoming people that, wow, we're on the edge of change. There's exciting things happening. Look at this. There's a new album out, and there's a worship album over here, and look at these books, and we've got all this stuff happening that, in my humble opinion, just loops again. It just goes round and round, but they're very good at stimulating this incessant excitement that, like, think how many years we've been looking forward to the return of Jesus, like just on the edge. It's going to happen. Oh my goodness, I can't wait. Adventists are masters at just keeping that tension elevated. I want you to dig a bit deeper. What takes you beyond feeling that this is just another one of those clever tricks that Adventists play?
Well, Peter, I'll say it the kind of the way I said with Nathan before. Adventism, this is not the first time there was an Adventist movement. The first time was the incarnation. We're coming up on Christmas. And the first Adventist was John the Baptist. And he did the Adventist work we're supposed to be doing. He wasn't just waiting. He was preparing the way of the Lord, making his path straight. Every valley shall be exalted, every mountain and hill made low, the crooked place straight, the rough place plain. Then the glory of the Lord will be revealed. It wasn't this, let's watch the world go to hell in a handbasket so the glory of the Lord can be revealed. It was, no, actually, let's prepare the way. And I think that this is unique in my estimation. The conversation is not about let's watch signs and tell you the coming is here, but it's actually let's get to work in this world. And that is a bold move. And I don't think we're leading it. I think there are young people who are leading it, and we are helping, maybe mediating, so administrators, because church ecclesiastical leaders in all traditions are going to move slower. But this is a mediatorial move to say our work here is let us have the legend about Martin Luther. When they asked him what did he want to do if he knew Jesus was coming tomorrow, he said, hoeing weeds in my garden. In other words, I'm not going to stop living my life waiting on the coming of the Lord. I'm going to live in this world because, and here's the key, it is theologically significant that we are here today.
Adventism, you mean?
Humans,
yeah.
We didn't just come into this world to get into the next.
Yeah.
There's a theological significance about being here. And if we don't understand and think about that, and if we think the only theological significance about being here is to try to get into the next one, that is a pretty thin and pretty anemic and a pretty childish engagement with the richness of a creator who brings this kind of diversity we are living amongst to celebrate. And we've been invited. Do you see what I'm saying? So in some respect, I'm saying this is not leading the way. It's discerning the times, because there are young people who are actually saying, no, we're going to talk about it differently, whether the official voice is making this or not. And let me tell you, you can find them all over on these social platforms that are unapologetically Adventist and unashamedly outside of the tradition of the slower ecclesiastical leaders. Now, Nathan, I may be talking too much, but
no, not at all.
I discern over here.
No, not at all. I think, like you said, though, there's a tendency for those Adventist young people to speak up and just keep on speaking up, and I love what they're doing. Like, I love it. It's like there's no Adventist kind of subculture that's going to hold me back from saying my truth. They're very upfront, but like you said earlier, they are shifting to be more following the Christian Protestant flow, and there's a huge number of Adventist young people leaving the church, upward of 45% I've heard. And Steve Brown has just mentioned here, I think the looping or recycling is probably a human thing, not just Adventist. We're probably just well practiced at it, and that's true. But I think the point I'm trying to drill home is that like if you follow a river that meanders down to the ocean, we have over here, billabongs where there'll be a river flow that eventually is cut off from the mainstream and has its own little ecosystem. I wonder sometimes if Adventism is that, and within that little stream, there's a longing to be back in the main river flow of the gospel and Jesus and doing all the things that he did, unfettered by Adventism. And what worries me is that sometimes the Adventism in the billabong that's been cut off, it does lots of shiny things to its young people to make them think it's gonna, that it not only is it that it is part of the mainstream, but that it's going to break the loop. So Stephen's right that it is a human thing, but I just wonder if and Nathan might like to add to this as well, because we've kind of chatted a bit about this before. I wonder if it's an Adventist intensified problem that I'm hoping this kind of material can break.
Nathan,
break this loop. I got discouraged. I turned 60 the other day. When I've seen this, I cannot just lend my hand to this positive looping that I'm giving to young people when I just don't think it's ever going to break. And then when I see the compliance document and the women getting suppressed even more.
But Peter, I have to say this. When I teach my classes, when I have Roman Catholic students or Adventist students, I'll ask questions like this. I'll say, how many of you are Roman Catholic Christians? They'll raise their hand. How many of you are Adventist Christians? Raise your hand. Then I ask the question, how many of you who are Roman Catholic Christians are this kind? I'm a Roman Catholic Christian. And how many of you say I'm a Roman Catholic Christian? And how many of you say I'm a Adventist Christian? And how many of you say I'm an Adventist Christian? I'm saying that to say, as Adventism is growing larger, you're going to see more and more who are going to say, I'm an Adventist Christian. And they won't be looping.
Yeah, but I wonder though, I wonder when they grasp that context, that concept, and I don't want this to be true. I'm wanting you guys to reassure me that it's not true. I love hearing what you're saying there, Maury, because that indicates to me, oh, good, there's empirical data to show that that's not happening in Maury's classroom. There's people there willing to say, I'm a Christian first. I'm pleased to hear that. I don't want to be, I'm not trying to be negative, but I'm just observing that the young people, when they start saying I'm Christian and then Adventist, eventually they leave and they carry on elsewhere. And I see that as a loss to the church, which could be this great resource, a great body, a great movement that can bring about great social change. And again, the book, I'm holding it up lots, but I think that is bringing about the kind of dialogue that is going to bring about potentially this, and maybe in 2 years' time, I go, good on you guys, you're back on the show. I no longer think Adventism is in its little village here. But I fear for these young people that go, awesome, let's make it happen. And systemically from the very top, they're getting the compliance document, they're getting suppression of women, they're getting a different message. They're getting 1 billion great controversy books flooded into the system. Right. And I want people that are watching this to not go, oh, disagree with me or agree with you, or I want people to have the dialogue, but to come away with, hey, what can we do that's positive?
I'm not disagreeing with you. There are those. They're on the spectrum. And what I'm simply saying is there are also those others. They know about all of this stuff and they pay as much attention to it as they do C-SPAN. They just live their life.
Yes, that's true.
And so I'm saying that you're right. You're observing a reality, but there's a spectrum, and there's another reality there. And if they leave the denomination, it doesn't mean they leave the church. Oftentimes they serve the church outside the denomination. I think you are serving the church. And I think you are serving the denomination. And I think others serve the denomination outside the church. and within it. So I'm just saying that spectrum is real. It's a real spectrum, and I believe it will continue to populate. I'm here to serve I'm here to serve the world as a Christian minister. That means I have to serve in the church, and I happen to also serve in a certain communion within the church, Adventist Christianity. And I have to make certain I'm clear that I'm a servant of Christ. And for me, and the conversations I've had with Nathan and the conversation partners we've included in here, I think they all are I'm pretty certain they all are pretty much sure that Adventism is a small leaf on a larger branch connected to a deeper trunk. And if we're not engaged in that deep tradition where our sources are coming from, we can die out on that limb. And we don't want that to happen. Nathan, I said too much, so if you don't talk, I come from a family of 6, man. If the food came to the table, you better start eating, because my brothers are 6 and they would eat it all up.
I love what you said there, Maury, and that is a good perspective, a good way to see the big picture of it. Nathan, can I ask you, technically speaking, like when Maury said before you approached him about doing a chapter or talking about the process of the whole thing, and he was worried that it might just be some written material left on his computer. One thing I've noticed about you, Nathan, over the years is that you are a doer. Like I love that about your character, your personality. You write, if you talk about something often, if I've seen you have a conversation somewhere, 6 months later there's a book out about it. I love that you make things happen, and I think that's something that Maury has found out, that you can approach people and you're going to do something, you make things happen. Tell us a little bit about how you made this book happen. What did you do to make it happen? Because it's a huge process.
Firstly, I agree with Dr. Cortman that I'm quite happy to sit here and listen to Maury preach and teach. And that's kind of good for the soul. So that's good. This book was a process. As we have already mentioned, it was more than 2 years from the first conversations to a book available near you. There was also a lot of political work in the background. And one of our biggest coups was getting the endorsement of the North American Division President on the back of the book, and that was a 15-month process. Wow. And partly because the book didn't quite exist in its finished form, but that we were having conversations about whether they would be, the leadership team of the North American Division would be prepared to support it in that way. And then at the same time, part of my impulse for doing that was not just trying to get some kind of endorsement for it, but also to legitimize it as a project that fitted within the mainstream of the Adventist Church. And so even though I'm a book editor at Science Publishing, I need to still convince my book committee that they're going to publish a book. And so I worked on this for the vast majority of that time without any assurance of where it might get published. And so I needed to do the work to actually make the case for the book, to build a potential business model for the book. And so, the best way any of our listeners can help me out here is by buying a copy, and perhaps buying a copy for everybody they know for Christmas, buying a box full for their church. A few things like that that'll just help that maths play out.
Because it is available at the ABCs in Australia too, isn't it?
Yes,
so
yes, and we're working.
You can walk into your local ABC. What's the equivalent in the States?
So there's Adventist Book Centers
well.
in the.
It's the same brand, isn't it?
Yeah. So we're working on getting them there. They aren't quite there yet. They are, but it is available from Amazon as a printed book and as an ebook everywhere in the world.
So you can get it as a Kindle.
Yeah. Yep.
On your Kindle.
So. Yeah. So that's a partly, and we're currently doing a print run of it at Science, but we've put it out in this way firstly to meet some deadlines, and to make it available initially, but also that we could simply make it available everywhere in the world, basically instantly, through the Amazon system. And I understand the challenges of Amazon, the ethics or not around that, but it also works. And we swallowed some of our what's the right word? Our ethical pride, perhaps, and made the most of the technology that is available in that way.
What do you mean by that?
Made just compromises.
Politics is the art of compromise. Well, simply the ethics of some of the labour practices and the exploitation of around Amazon around the world, and but the reality, and simply how they've, from a book industry perspective, how they have completely overwhelmed the book publishing industry,
like Spotify to musicians,
that kind of thing. Yes,
yeah.
And which gives you access, but also comes with. That's right. It has some challenges associated with it, both ethically and business-wise, and all of those kind of things. So, but our first thing was, let's just make this available as broadly as we can, and we want to really spark a true conversation within Adventism, both about the issues themselves, which are vitally important, and also about, again, modeling this idea of conversation, but also modeling as we've already touched upon, this process of Adventism, listening to the world and then responding from the uniqueness of our faith to actually make a contribution to the world around us in meaningful and real ways, both ideologically and practically, because of what we believe. Being true to the best of what we believe is transformative of the world around us if we actually approach it, if we expect it to be. And too often we haven't expected to be. I think I reference in my chapter a brief quote from Chuck Scriven, where he talks about Adventism as often having had an eschatology of resignation, and simply that we sit back and let the world, as Maury said earlier, go to hell, and almost perversely celebrate that fact at times. Whereas I believe we're called to an eschatology of engagement, actually practicing hope, where we get in and make a difference. And to me, one of the real antecedents of this project is that race is a theological issue. Now, I did a master's program through the mid-teens through a college in the US, a master's of justice and theology. And in that process, and it overlapped with some of the earlier Black Lives Matter protests and movements. And then by the time I was finished it, Trump was president of the US. And we saw that progression and the reactionism of racism, which was the momentum for Trump being elected, and is the only possible rationale for him to continue to be relevant in any way. And so I was a part of a number of discussions and had some opportunities to do intensive summer school classes with some key Black Christian leaders in the US. Some really great opportunities. And at the end of that process, and Peter, you're well aware that for many years I've talked about the idea of justice as a key part of our faith, that we need to practice that we need to be understanding our faith as a call to justice as much as anything else. But one of the key things I took away from that study program was simply that underneath so many of these justice questions is racism. And I think that's a very significant question. And really it comes down to a theological failure that we say we believe in, that God created us all in the image of God, and that is the core of what it means to be a human being, but then we don't practice it. And the reason that so much injustice exists in the world is because we actually don't believe that everybody else is as valuable as we are, and that the more different they are, and one of the real shorthands for that is if they look different, the greater the difference there, the more significant the gap between our call to do justice and our practice of justice. And so modern racism effectively began in the 15th century. Before that, it wasn't the same kind of thing. There's certainly aspects of ethnic and family and cultural divides that we can see in the Bible and some of these things. But effectively, modern racism began with the expansionism, the colonialism of the 15th century, or beginning in the 15th century, and that was given, based under the doctrine of discovery. We have these very significant papal decrees that basically divided the world into the good European people and everybody else who were the barbarians and the pagans, and that they could be used and exploited and displaced and basically kept in slavery for everybody else's profit.
Weren't the Arabs and the French doing the same thing, but just calling it their like the Catholics were speaking to their world, but the Arabs were speaking to their world and dividing it up under their own image, and the French and the Vikings was dividing up into their own image as well. Are you saying the Catholics were doing it as a global kind of thing that eventually turned into racism?
Well, I'm not talking about the Catholics. I'm talking about the Europeans, who between the Europeans ended up covering more than 80% of the globe.
You're calling European Catholics the same
colonialism,
French, and so French colonialism as well. You're putting that into one thing, or? I'm not asking because I know anything. Yeah. I'm asking to learn.
So I'm not so worried about it as a religious thing at this point. It became the theological rationale for a global economic system, right, that was colonialism through the next 300 to 400 centuries, 300 400 years.
And you're saying that's ground zero that formulated this garden bed that racism grew, a new kind of racism.
What we see as modern racism, yes. Right. And so that, but there is a theological underpinning for that. And so everything, I mean, even in Australia, and Maury will have to excuse me for a minute while we have an Australian conversation. We talk about the Mabo decision as a key decision in recognising that there were Indigenous people in Australia before European colonisation in the late 18th century. So one of the things that often gets talked about in the context of the Mabo case, where we celebrated the 30th anniversary of that this year, was this doctrine of terra nullius. Now that's a good Latin phrase that comes directly from one of those papal decrees in the middle of the 15th century. The Latin kind of helps you, gives you that hint. That these would be empty lands that the European colonizers could come into. Now, isn't it fascinating, completely mind-blowing when you stop and recognize that it's only 30 years ago that Australia officially, politically, legally got to the saying, well, actually, that wasn't true. It was a legal and theological fiction that allowed us to displace our Indigenous peoples up until that time, and in many ways still continue to have that same effect. And so we go back to 15th century theology that allowed us to then build a rationale for this burgeoning European colonization. And we recognize that for all our celebration of reformations and some of those kind of things that Adventists have done in our history, nobody's really ever got to addressing these issues. And so when I as a descendant of Christianity, an inheritor of the tradition, recognize this as a theological issue, or it's got theological roots, the first thing is that it should give me pause. It's a sobering reality that I should confess, that my faith tradition has been one of the enabling philosophies, theologies that has caused the domination and led to, right up to the present day, the current expressions of racism and systemic racism that we see in our world today. Then the other side of that is there anything more Adventist than saying we need to reform theology, we need to find better theology, and that theology is actually something we know what to do with. And at our best, both that this call to recover better theology and to reclaim the highest possible ground in our theology, and also to practice our theology. And that is what we're called to do. And so this is where I find myself saying, well, racism is a theological issue. We know what to do with theology, so let's do some better theology around this issue. And that has the potential to be world transforming.
Peter, if I could just say this, because
Thanks,
what Nathan has done is beautiful. And I think for those who might be listening who are in the Adventist heritage, there's a kind of conflating and confusing of belief, doctrine, dogma, and theology all into one. So that when we talk about the fundamental beliefs, we may actually mean doctrine, or we may actually mean dogma, but they're not all, these are not the same. You see my point? And so Nathan is pointing out something that it takes, again, the question is, we've grown big, but now it's time to grow up. It's time to know, if I believe something, I'm assenting to a proposition. I believe this chair can hold my weight. That's a belief. But a doctrine is a complex belief. It requires believing a lot of different things to hold the doctrine together. And a dogma is a doctrine that if you don't believe, you're out the community.
Yes, yeah.
And theology is how we work this out. And so what Nathan has done, he's pointing out something that's very important. Thomas Oden wrote a book, How Africa Shaped the Western Mind. When I use this in some of the classes, it's a shock to have this Yale scholar of European descent actually doing a good engagement of Athanasius, Augustine, Tertullian, all of these African theologians who really shaped Christian doctrine for the West. How you get, by the time this racialized doctrines of Christianity emerged in the 15th, 16th centuries, how you moved so far away is an important and telling birth certificate. This is the point. And James Cone theologically tries to say, look here, in America, white supremacist Christianity is a theological heresy of Docetism. And that's why he wrote this book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. How can you lynch people and then worship the crucified Christ unless you don't believe that God could be in them? That's a Docetic doctrine. It seems as if, but no, God can't be there.
Wow.
See, so if we don't do more theological reflection, we can collapse that rich kind of engagement into doctrines, dogmas, and beliefs. And we lose the opportunity in which theology itself can become a kind of interpretive tool of what's happening in the social world, where the Christian has to now make a statement to say, no, that's not the way of Christ. And the scholars who have contributed all seem to actually trace it in this kind of same birth certificate, so that we can kind of say what has happened in Christianity, where well-intentioned people can be completely oblivious to this theological heresy proclaiming the name of Christ. James Cone called it the Antichrist, standing in the place of the real Christ. And we got seduced. And so this is again an opportunity for us to say, let's stay awake, let's stay engaged, let's learn from each other in the process. When Nathan says mainstream, he did hit the mainstream, because I can tell you there are Adventist Christians who think this is way too liberal, and there are those who think this is too milquetoast. I just had a group of men who were a bunch of African-American intellectuals I sit with, and they thought, you guys aren't hitting this right and hard. And then after hearing them, dispute amongst each other, they kind of said, well, yeah, this does grow us a little, because they're way out in this. They've been engaged in
Mm.
this conversation for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and they've been thinking about it. And
Were they
talking
Adventist scholars that you were talking? These guys you were talking to?
Adventist or had been
Both.
Adventist.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
My uncle in his late 80s, yeah, he was baptized by E.E. Cleveland. He's moved beyond the denomination, but he stays engaged in this conversation and in a communion with Adventist Christians who he realizes are good conversation partners, and we help to grow each other. And so when I say this is, I think Nathan has an ear for what is tolerable in the main line. And I have learned from him through this process. It has guided me. And as I say, it's brought more faith that it's possible. And even the struggles that it took with the NAD president wasn't a struggle of commitment to it. I found this out in a conversation in Denver, actually, with his assistant. But it was about timing. It was about other issues of just the busyness of ecclesiastical issues. And hearing that from an ecclesiastical leader made me say, even in that position, the younger and newer blood is moving us, not in the radical ways of the young in the classroom, but it is in certain pockets saying, hey, we have to open up this conversation and discourse. And the sneaky thing is new ways of resourcing our text of scriptures that we don't loop, in other words. Find out that the beast can be something about colonialism. The beast can be something about white supremacy. And we can go to those old tropes about Catholicism when the Catholic tradition has actually moved in a different, more progressive way. So let's not miss the forest for the trees.
I think the other thing sometimes with this is simply that we haven't, there's a lot of people that recognize some of these things. Excuse me. There's a lot of people who have studied these things. And I've had experiences where I've spoken and I've quoted James Cone, for example, and he's somebody that a lot of our authors have referenced. We've referenced him a couple of times here. He's included in the epigraph of the book. That I've quoted him in a sermon, and I've had people that have surprised me who have come up and said, I'm so glad to hear someone quoting James Cone. And people that are preachers who would never quote him from the pulpit. And not that I'm saying you have to, but people that would surprise you who say, this is something that we should be thinking about, to which I say, well, why aren't you sharing that in the ministry that you're doing? And there is this kind of, I do the rounds of camp meetings when they're on, for various reasons, and we'll often have very interesting conversations with the speakers that are at camp meetings, in delegates' dining rooms and things like that.
Yeah.
And then I go and hear them preach, and I just shake my head and say, well, when do we actually lead people?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. It really
you've had those experiences too.
Huge.
And so everybody's waiting for this opportunity to, for the first one to jump because they expect that they'll get whacked, whoever's the first person to speak out. And so what we need is more people that will simply say, hey.
Yeah.
And if we all speak at once, they can't whack us all.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's one of the strengths of getting people to write in a book rather than just be you. But there is this reality in the church that, there's even many senior leaders that recognize that so much of what we do as a church isn't the best it could be.
No.
Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong or that it's, but that a lot of, and you spend a lot of your time on this podcast, Peter, fixated on Ted Wilson. You spend more time talking about Ted Wilson than anyone I know.
Hey, that doesn't mean anything. Just because I don't like Hillary Clinton doesn't mean I like Trump.
And for most of us, Ted Wilson is relatively irrelevant.
Yeah.
And for most of what happens at your local church, and I'm not picking on Ted in particular, I'm just talking about the higher you go in the church, the further removed from reality they are. And I had the opportunity to speak at a South Pacific Division Executive Committee meeting just a couple of years ago. And what I said to them is, there's a mistake that all you people here are tempted towards, which is thinking this is the church.
Mm.
And it's not. It's a business meeting that runs some aspects of the church and most of the time is irrelevant to what happens at a local church near you most weeks. At their best, they support what happens there. At their worst, they get in the way. And most of the time, it doesn't matter. And so we need to recognize that there is so the further you go up in the church, the more that is a reality. And I think that by fixating on a particular, and I'm having a bit of a go at you, Peter, because I've watched too many of your SDAQ&A
I feel
interviews.
flattered that you've watched enough to be able to do such a survey. We've worked out that I spent a lot of time talking about Ted. and I'm glad to hear that you think he's as irrelevant as I do. I think that's kind of honesty.
When I have the opportunity to, listen to some of the people, and one of the privileges I've had of working on this book project is to spend time with people like Maury and with so many of our contributors who are incredibly smart, intelligent, well-read, thoughtful people that at least are nudging us towards Adventism at its best. And that's where we need to put our effort into. And so on your good days, Peter, when you are highlighting people like this, then...
I'm not going to hold your book up. That's it.
We're doing something good.
I will say this, though. The reason I do... I'm not defending myself, but the reason I do...
No, I'm overplaying my hand.
The reason I do sometimes talk about him is because I watched the Autumn Councils. I watched the compliance document gain its teeth. I watched the Danish and the Norwegians get warned. 6 unions got warned. Promise of reprimands and sanctions to follow. You can't tell me there's no trickle-down effect. One of the reasons when I say, pastors, can you please come on my show, ordained pastors, and say I support women's ordination, and they won't. The one reason they won't is because of Ted Wilson. And does that affect the women in the Adventist church? Does that continue the suppression? Do people like, I won't mention names, but there's many women left the church in recent weeks because of the lack of support of the pastors who are silent, and they're silent as a direct result of Ted Wilson.
If I could say something that might actually speak to the truth that both you and Nathan are saying.
Good work. Do some peacemaking here. We need some counseling, Pastor.
I think it's important. Peter, if you watch the Autumn Council, that's good. It'd be nice if they took the camera everywhere. The General Conference leader goes. And here's just a brief. I took my students on a guided study tour to the General Conference in 2010 when he got elected to take a course in Adventist church polity. I saw his homily there, and I saw him stop the audience from clapping and insisting, and they stopped. The next year, I took my students to a guided study tour to Festival of the Laity in Dallas, Texas. Maybe about 20, 30,000, but it seemed like only the regional conferences got the memo because it was about 90% Black. And the guide who organizes it, my study tour, he said, guess who's on the list to preach? Ted Wilson. I said, well, I'm gonna really observe, because if he tells these Negroes to stop clapping and keeps insisting, they're gonna walk him out of this place. And guess what? He tried and he tried and he stopped, and he embraced the clapping. The point is, what Nathan is saying. The ground tells you how you're going to behave. And if the closer anyone gets to the ground, you'll see where they'll have to either moderate or abandon their principles on don't clap or anything else. And that moderation is not a giving up on principle, but maybe reflecting on what is actually the principle and the rule I'm trying to hold up. You know, thou shalt not kill has a more fundamental principle of don't murder, which is unjustified killing, right? And so in some respect, you're getting a reflection, but you're getting a reflection of a dance at a level that doesn't happen on the ground. I can tell you, having pastored, the members of the congregation might get the Adventist Review, but it's going to be good starter for the kindling, because they're going to be reading other things. And that's why Nathan can be at the camp meeting or at a church and preach, and they're going to say, I'm glad you referenced James Cone, because there's so much material out here to read and take serious. And the members do. The members do. I don't want to be dismissive of organizational need to give some kind of shepherding through their media, but I studied this. And sometimes that shepherding has not come near to the way it can. And I commend again what Science Publishing is doing, because it's a bold way of saying we care enough for you and respect you enough to offer you something that we think, although it may be diverse voices, although it might not be a kind of, this is the summary that we have to agree on kind of project. It's a place where we can have a real engaged conversation as a community that's growing in Christ together.
Yeah, boy, this is a good conversation. And I think ultimately the best demonstration of this conversation is people with diverse views having a conversation. And I like, now that I have no business address apart from my office here, I literally do enjoy cafe culture, and every day I'm having lunch with someone at a cafe and putting on a bit of weight and getting my sugar levels up. But in the conversation, and I catch up with a diverse bunch of people, and we'll often be having a robust disagreement, and they'll say, well, what does church look like for you? And I just go, the conversation we're having right now, the warm brew and the look across the lake. And that's how I feel about this kind of conversation. And again, and I will hold it up, Nathan, that's what I think's one of the most beautiful things about this book, is it is a diverse range of people having a conversation, wanting to move forward. And ultimately, that's what we all want. We all want to have a nicer community where the leaders are offering pastoral care, where we're enjoying each other, music, dance, singing, eating, conversation, bush dancing. We do want to have fellowship together.
Nice of you to relent, Peter.
To relent.
It's good of you to be forgiving.
Yeah, I will. Yeah. Nothing to forgive.
How real what you said is. Hans Gutierrez takes on the man who I probably, next to James Cone, is Cornel West, who I've read every book James Cone has written, and I have read almost every book Cornel West has written. And Hans Gutierrez decided to challenge Cornel West, and I thought, how dare my friend? And yet I learned so much from it.
Yeah.
That I am now going to reread a little more critically and less charitably. To me, one of the most intellectual giants of the 20th and 21st century, because an Adventist theologian and scholar has said, hey, what he has to say about Black Christianity, he hasn't said it radical enough. And he ends with this most beautiful two parables of Jesus, the hidden treasure and the parable of the pearl of great price. And he says, hey, look, in one, God is our treasure, and the other, we are God's treasure. We have things that God needs us to hold on to so God can have the treasure God desires out of us. And I thought, wow, this is a rich way for me to keep my Black identity as a part of God's story outside of the story of God in Christ. In other words, if I say that Christ is Lord of the church, that's true. But I also believe Christ is Lord of the world. And that means there are things that are happening in the world that I need to attend to that's outside of the church. And I thank Dr. Gutierrez for his engagement. So this is that kind of work that helps us all hear in a different key, from a different tone, and reflect on and to be self-critical.
And it's okay to disagree. Like one of the things so there's nothing of Ted Wilson's politics or theology, very little of it, that I would agree with, but I respect that he is trying to pull together a kind of Adventism that resonates with a large population of the Adventist church, a more conservative fundamentalist Adventist style, and he is trying to systematically and politically pull that into play. And I like that he's quite upfront about that. He's not doing the behind the scenes. This is what I think he's saying. This is what I want to see happen. This is what I'm going to implement to make happen. And I think that there are winds of change and discontent that will blow down onto you guys that you haven't quite felt just yet. And maybe in a couple of years' time, and I hope I'm wrong, it'll go one way or the other. There's coming a time where it's going to go one way or the other, where the congregation that you speak to that is largely unaware of the top politics can grow and remain oblivious to it, or they are going to become very apparent of the constriction, oppression, and suppression that's on its way. And I hope I'm wrong, and Nathan thinks I'm wrong, and that's where we disagree. But that's okay.
We've had this discussion a few times.
That's okay, because we can still have a coffee at Double Take in Toronto and enjoy the big picture, which I love about what you're alluding to, Maury. And I love too something you said earlier about the people lynching others and then going to church and not seeing God in the humanity. We dehumanize people, and we've got to be careful not to throw ad hominem attacks on people in such a way that I'm not going to speak to Nathan to try and dehumanize him, and he doesn't do that to me. That's so important that we maintain that sense of, we respect the humanness, we expect the divinity within our humanness. Because that's when we go off the rails, when we start to go, oh, you are this kind of person, I will delete you and cancel you.
Right.
Can I just shift focus a little bit, because I wanted to just talk a little bit about some of the authors that had on board. Can you just think of any funny stories that happened in the compiling of the book, where any little interesting things happened on a personal level, or was it all pretty plain sailing and no issues?
Well, writing and putting together a book isn't much of a spectator sport, so it's a lot of it's really, really boring to look at from the outside. We've had some great conversations with some of the contributors, and even just last month there was a couple of panel discussions that happened at La Sierra University Church, and then at the Adventist Society for Religious Studies meetings. And while I wasn't there, I got to watch one of them online live stream and to interact with the others as well. And just again, you get reminded of the real people behind these things. Everybody brings their own story and their own experiences, but also the diversity of people. And even that diversity was a select group within the larger group, but still people bringing their different experiences to it. And so that was, a really positive thing. To some degree, we put together, when we sequenced the book, one of the ways we sequenced it is from the familiar to the unfamiliar. So I've got some challenging news for you, Peter, which is that it gets harder to read the further you go through it. Both, I think, in its level of complexity, but also in the I guess, more unfamiliar challenges that are within some of those later chapters.
Well, I noticed the footnotes increase later on in the book.
Yeah, well, that's kind of symptomatic. That's how these academics get on. And one of my jobs as an editor trying to create a book for a that's not necessarily a purely academic book is to say we need to keep this as accessible as possible. And that's one of, I hope that was part of my contribution to the project. And even one of our authors, who was very early on in the process, when we sent back a proof pages to all the contributors, she realized that, mine's the only chapter that doesn't have footnotes in this. And that was one of the reasons why I liked it, because it was just a simple focus. But the book moves from the first few are focused on, we begin with the Old Testament prophets and then into Adventist prophetic understanding, so New Testament prophecy. We spend some time looking at Jesus and grace and salvation, and then it moves into sort of more Adventist history, or some more sort of Adventist doctrines, then Adventist history, then moves on to more practical things of ministry, of political engagement, and then broadens out basically as you go. So the idea is kind of, we start with God and the call of the prophets, which is a huge thing in itself, but the ideas get more complex and more complicated as you move through the book. But one of the things I really appreciated, even with Hans Gutierrez's piece, which is, it takes some reading, it's pretty heavy duty theology and philosophy involved in it. But then he finishes with this very simple focus on these two parables of Jesus, and that it's all summed up in this. And, particularly with the pearl of great price, that each person is of estimable value to God, and that changes everything. And so, there's I really appreciated and enjoyed working with this material because there's just so much good stuff in it. A number of the presentations, or a couple of the chapters I heard in presentation form at different points in their evolution as well. And one of my favorite images from the book, we've talked about James Cone and his cross-referencing between the cross and the lynching tree, and what a significant and profound thing that is. Kendra Valentine in her chapter almost does the opposite. In the closing of her chapter, she points to the prophecies in Revelation of a crowd of every nation, kindred, tongue, and people, and says, might not we be seeing some glimpse of that? And she wrote this in late 2020 in the protest that we see happening around the world for justice in the context of racism. Why can't we see that, the goodness in the world around us, and celebrate that as even a foretaste of what God's ultimate intention for humanity is, when we see all these different people raising their voices for something good and just. The best of our Adventism should be celebrating that, and of course, joining in with that, because that is God's righteous intention for humanity. And I think that, to me, that's just such a profound one of those moments where you go, that's incredible, that's great. And so I think that's even when you invite good people to say good things, you'll get sent good stuff. And and that was the experience of working on this book, is you learn things from that, you're encouraged by it, and then you're excited to be able to share it with the wider world. A couple of book covers wrapped.
Oh, good insights. Well said, Nathan. We'll close in a minute, and I hesitate asking this question, but it's such an important topic and it's an important conversation, and I don't think people can really connect or move forward unless this particular question is asked. A lot of people wrote to me about it beforehand, and it's not like, I loved what you said, Maury, about this. What is it within Adventism where you can find the good resources to pull together? The answer in any kind of way to this question doesn't diminish this book or what you're doing or the progress of how Adventism responds positively to race and racism. But the Ellen White quote of amalgamation of man and beast, it is a difficult one for a lot of people in the world to get over. Since leaving the church, I've had a lot more people talk about that than when I was in the church. And so I do not raise this in any way to be confrontational. But I think people need to know, how have you personally, Maury, Nathan, have you thought about it? How does the community at large answer that in a way that can be let go of, if you know what I mean, so that people can move forward? Because to a lot of people, Ellen White's statements on the amalgamation of man and beast, with the inferences that seem to be carrying from what she'd said, stop them having any kind of positive notion about the conversation of how Adventist responds to faith and racism. I know I've kind of unpacked that a little bit bigger than I needed to, but
so Maury, can I make you do the hard work here? You're the professor.
Well, I'll tell you, I tried to do the hard work the easy way. I said, Nathan, let's get Ron Osborne's article that he published with Spectrum into the book as one of our chapters. And I think Ron Osborne did an excellent job of trying to point out in the most gentle way, she failed and then grew. She had opportunity at times to reject those ideas, to clarify them. It wasn't done. But toward the end, she began to realize, hold on, there's some dignity in everyone. And so I think, it says, here's what's very, I think, important to keep in mind. I'll just reference my chapter, and this is not out of a shameless plug. But I want to say it as a warning, because when Nathan says some of the chapters get more, intellectually demanding, it might not be that they're using words that are big, but the words they're using in technical ways. That if you're not aware of the technical ways that are being used, you're going to wonder how they are relating the issues in the chapter that they are relating. And a buddy of mine, who he was my we shared an apartment together at Oakwood College. He's a professor. He's not an Adventist. He's not even a Christian or a theist. He's an agnostic, and he's been that way for a couple of decades. But he picked it up and read it, and we had a conversation. And when we had the conversation, he said, "Maury, you didn't say that in the book." I said, "But I did. You thought I said more. I tried to correlate sin and racism. And I'm trying to say that, guess what? Racism is a unique kind of sin, because it's the sin that parrots the parent. It behaves like sin. It's broadly patterned. And so it manifests here, it manifests there, it manifests here, it manifests there. It's an experience we have that's not distinct in this, that, or the other. That's not the data of racism. The data of racism is like the data of sin. It's a broad pattern of existence. Now, if I talk of it that way. But if you know Maury Jackson's a Black author writing about this, you think I'm talking about white people until you realize I'm talking about sin. That means Black people. We have the same problem with racism that everyone else, because it's a sin problem, and it's a unique type of sin problem. And so I think in the same way that people might have, I have to forgive myself for past racist acts and attitudes and behaviors. Why wouldn't I forgive Ellen White?
Yeah.
Or anyone else for that matter. You see the point? So we can say that was a failure. I'm not going to defend that. I'm not going to defend arguing for people to worship in separate Black and white churches. I don't care. You could talk about Booker T. Washington all you want. He was wrong. Right? That's the point. But we all grow.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that Cortman lifted up some areas of showing, even in the complex history of Ellen White, like our own complex history. What does it say? There is a depth in man that is deep as the deepest hell, and a height high as the highest heaven. We have to recognize that is the complexity of what it means to be a human walking in this journey. And so we can talk about we can name the worst was not good, and we can at the same time name that they are not at their worst. I like Paul Tillich's way of talking about grace. Grace is both forgiveness and fulfillment. You can't drop so low that God won't catch you, and you can't grow so high that there's not more room for your development. And however Ellen White or any of us end our life in our growth with Christ, there's still room to grow.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Yeah. I hope that does it, not scholarly, but pastorally.
Yeah, I needed to hear that. That was very well said. And
can I add one other thing, which is also drawn from Ron Osborne's article on Spectrum, or published in Spectrum on this particular topic, and that's simply that those who have grimly sought to defend the inerrancy of Ellen White have created the problem.
Yeah.
Because it you pull out a couple of passing comments that may have reflected her understanding at the time, may have reflected the cultural and social understanding of the time, were not significant points in what she was saying. It's not the point of what she was writing. Then those who have been queried on those comments, who could not abide the fact that she could have just simply copied something from the culture around her that may not have been 100% right, 100% righteous, to use that kind of language. And then they've written articles defending that this is somehow right. And that creates the problem.
That's true.
And so, as Maury said, we couldn't just say, well, that's a bit awkward. That was a bit messy. Let's shrug our shoulders and focus on what this article, what that chapter was actually about, what this book was actually about, and then move on. But we've got to defend it grimly, because every word has to be even though she said it wasn't, every word was dictated by an angel. And so they have created, the defenders of Ellen White, again, in the grim defense of her supposed inerrancy or assumed inerrancy that they have assumed, not her, have created a problem that most people would never have even known about. And simply then would have been simply dismissed as, thinking of the times, let's move on. And so it has been perpetuated. And Ron Osborne in his article actually traces how this got the biggest picture. The biggest attention for this was in the articles written to defend it, not in the writing itself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we've created a problem where we were looking for a solution for a problem that didn't exist.
Yeah.
If only we could have simply said, okay, and moved on.
Yeah.
And so we've even amplified the original statements by virtue of giving them all this attention that they didn't deserve.
I remember when I read The White Lie by Walter Ray, and that blew me out of the water. But where I really lost my faith in Ellen White was when I read The White Truth, which was released as an apologetics for Ellen White, a support of Ellen White from the powers that be. It raised to be way more issues and problems. I think you're right there. Do you think, Ellen, and you can both answer this if you like, do you think she was a prophet?
Here's what I would say. I think of my mentor, Charles Teal, who really, I had left Oakwood College, came to La Sierra University to finish, and I was in a class with him. He had us read the prophet Amos. And he said, every time Amos speaks out against social oppression in his day, mark those verses with an S. Every time he speaks out against judicial corruption in his day, mark those verses with a J. Every time he speaks against economic violence in his day, mark those verses with an E. Every time he speaks against religious apostasy in his day, mark those with an R. And every time he predicts the future, mark those verses with a P. I still have that Bible that I went through. He's speaking against social oppression, political injustice, judicial corruption, religious apostasy. A couple of predictions of the future that are conditional. And I remember Charles Teal telling us the primary role of the biblical prophet was not to foretell the future, but was to foretell, to speak out against injustice in the prophet's own day and time. And then he had us read Stride Toward Freedom. And then ask us, what did you learn? I'll tell you, I'll never forget what a lot of students at La Sierra learned. Martin King actually had a doctorate. I thought they just called him Dr. King. But then he asked, did he speak out against social oppression in his day, judicial corruption, religious apostasy, economic violence? And did he predict what would happen to this nation if it didn't turn its course? My understanding of the prophetic role shifted. So it's a loaded term to say, do I think someone's a prophet? Am I going to say, did Ellen White speak to the issues of social injustice in her day? And she thinks of health reform, women's reform, the abolitionist cause. I'm going to give her a nod. And I'm going to give her a nod with all the complexity that I would give any prophet, even Martin King, who we know some of the disturbing problems of his own personal life. But I'm going to affirm King as a prophet.
I think the claim within Adventism, though, is that Ellen is a prophet with the kind of authority of the biblical prophets. Would you say King has that kind of prophetic elevation as well? It doesn't seem to be the same claim that people make about King as they do about White.
I would make the claim that the prophet is the prophet, period. But there are canonical prophets and there are non-canonical prophets. And Ellen White and Martin King are not canonical.
Right.
Nor was Nathan. I don't mean you, Nathan. I mean David's chaplain. And that's why we don't have the book of Nathan. So you could be in that prophetic role without being canonized. Now, this is what I would call a rough and dirty answer to the question, right? Because the question is of less importance to me in the sense that I think, and I will say it this way, I think the challenge with Ellen White is an American Adventist and maybe Australian Adventist problem, but not a world Adventist problem. Because let me tell you, you go to so many other places in the world, they're going to say, yes, we believe in her, and they're going to do whatever they're going to do anyway against her teachings.
So it is irrelevant whether
That's
they
what happens,
think it or not. Yeah, they
that's
just
the reality.
the humanness shines through yet again. Yeah.
Yeah. In other words, they don't give the same weight that we often think everyone in the communion of the church gives to.
Yeah. One of the comments that I'd make in response to that question was simply that I have a higher regard for Ellen White, having worked on this book project, than perhaps previously. Yeah. And we've already referenced Matt Corkman's chapter and how he, the echoes he finds in her writing and her approach to some of these issues, which were ahead of their time, which are still some of the things, even when she talked about paying reparations to the descendants of slaves in the US context, that's still highly controversial politically. So there were things that she really led the way. One of my favorite quotes was a summary. I mean, I am hesitant to claim the title of prophet for someone who didn't, who rejected that title for themselves.
Right.
That she didn't claim to be a prophet. She claimed to be a messenger, and that's a significant difference, I think.
Is that a nice little loophole, though? Because the church definitely regales her as something more than a messenger.
Well,
yeah, and I mean, there was
angel, isn't it? Angelos.
What was that, Maury? You cut out a bit there for a second.
The Greek word for messenger is angelos, is angel.
Even worse.
And I mean, there were deep concerns over the statement regarding Ellen White that was, to get back to your favourite topic, Peter, that was voted through the GC session this year.
No ad hominem. Stop trying to make me out to be a dummy.
No. But to me, one of the best summaries that we have of Ellen White's work came from A.G. Daniels at her funeral in 1915, where he sought to summarize her work. And he went through a number of categories in which you could consider, and this is, I think it's in the book Life Sketches or one of those books, where he made this statement. This was part of his sort of sketch or tribute that was paid at, or eulogy would be the correct terminology, that was he delivered at her funeral in 1915. And he made this statement: slavery, the caste system, unjust racial prejudice, the oppression of the poor, the neglect of the unfortunate, these are all set forth, and he's talking about in the writings and work of Ellen White, as unchristian and a serious menace to the well-being of the human race, and as evils which the Church of Christ is appointed by her Lord to overthrow. That's massively significant, strong language. And, that's what, that was his summary of her attitudes on these topics. Now, he worked with her for many years of his life, and particularly the last part of her life, which maybe there's something significant there, that was more a focus in her later, her more mature stage of ministry. To me, that's it's just such a strong statement that the church is called to overthrow racism and racial prejudice, casteism, and poverty. That would be a pretty good marching order, for us as a church today.
And it's interesting, and I'm alluding to Michael's book, the 1919 and the 1922, and the lost minutes of the 1919 conference. If A.G. Daniels' words had been listened to and adhered to, the church potentially could have gone through a whole new direction.
And that's where you see, what Michael has sketched out in his two books, and then even in his chapter in this book, the if we'd picked up what Daniels was saying in 1915, and that was our defining understanding of Ellen White, we would be reading her very differently today.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, again, our drift towards fundamentalism, our desperate desire for inerrancy, our overblown claims for the prophetic have caused us a lot of problems.
And when I said Michael before, I was referring to Michael Campbell, because
Yeah.
I've interviewed him, and his books are fantastic. So if I had one, I'd hold it up, but I've got the Kindle versions of those. And I think that does play to a deeper part of this conversation. The Ted Wilson government, the Ted Wilson politic, he is trying to get back to a 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s Adventism. And I have, when I read the 1919 minutes and realized that people like Prescott and Daniels were hoping and yearning for the kind of Adventism that perhaps Ellen White was leaning towards before she died, Adventism would have been a very different church today. And we've seen hints of it with questions on doctrine, where there was moves to bring about this kind of environment, or to shift the DNA of Adventism so that this kind of justice could prevail. And as you look back through the post QOD, the Des Ford, all the many people that were speaking progressively during that time, there was excitement. I remember being on campus here at Avondale as a young boy and just going, wow, there's an air of an excitement about all the young students. When I was in high school or Sabbath school, I'd see them out on the lawn, and they'd have Bibles, and they'd have their hippie hair, and they'd have their flared jeans, but they were kind of talking about Jesus in a social justice context and bringing about change. And they had soup kitchens, and they were going on outreach programs on the street, and it was a very exciting time. But when I hit the early 80s, I noticed all those guys left the church because of the Ted Wilson's father, essentially, and the way Glacier View was hammered home, and it just from there to now has thrown people into a state of fear to speak up again. And so thank you, both of you, for being willing to speak up, even though there may be opposition to what you're saying and doing. But like you said earlier, Nathan, if more and more people do it, the less that can be stopped. And with social media these days, you can speak up a lot more as well, which is exciting to see. We had Pastor Neil Thompson on the program a week or two ago. He's ordained, he's currently employed, and he proudly got up and said, I support women's ordination. And that's the first person that's come on the show from the SPD realm that has been willing to do that. And I've now got people calling up saying, oh, can we come on the show? We'd like to express our public support for women's ordination. So what you guys are doing is fantastic. And I hope that my predictions of cold winds blowing do not eventuate. I really want to thank you guys for coming on the show today. Any last comments before we go? And everyone, just while the guys are having a pause for thought there, go and buy this book. Honestly, go down to your ABC, do it now. Go and call them up, put one aside for me, please, order one in, or go onto Kindle and download it. It's a really great book. Last words and thoughts, remunerations.
I'll try and tie mine to something I put in the chapter and what you just said. Part of the reason I speak, I don't want to speak carelessly, because as a shepherd of Christ and as one who's been dealt with tenderly with Christ, I want to be tender. So, but I speak with courage. I try to, because it's not about, let me say it the way Dietrich Bonhoeffer says it, the church is not the human ideal, it's the divine reality. The church is real, in the eschaton. It's realized there. It's actualizing in history. And so it's going to have ups and downs and movements back and forth. But ultimately, it's a truth that we aren't worried about. And so what I try to say is that denominationalism is the religious cousin to racism. And we have to think about the church very ecumenical. We have to think about the church as that reality in the eschaton that God holds in the Christ, and that we are actualizing toward it in history. And therefore, in so many ways, as we nudge each other forward, we also have to be able to remember grace is both forgiveness and fulfillment. And so we have to offer forgiveness when we fall, but we also have to call people to higher heights to grow into the fullness of the stature of Christ. And I think you are doing that, Peter, in your role in this body of Christ, and we're trying to do it in our role in the body of Christ and in a fellowship or communion of Adventist Christians. And we don't have to worry. God is in control. The church is realized. And if I'm not saying I support women's ordination, it's because we ordain women in the Pacific Union. The odd ones out here don't support.
The thing is, you guys got warned for it before lockdown and were told you had to come into line. I mean, lucky lockdown came along and that kind of put that off the table until next year.
No, women are being ordained in the Pacific Union. They still have credentials, and they're still getting them.
Well, I'm glad that did you just say then you do support women's ordination? You did say that just then, did you?
Oh, let me be. Oh, I know we have to go. I just want to say this: if our doctrine, and this is important, if we believe in the priesthood of all believers, and if the ordained priest is just a representative priest, then how could you have a representative priest with only one sex? This would not be a Protestant doctrine. So I don't see how theologically one could not support the ordination of women unless you want to get rid of an ordered priesthood.
Are you ordained?
I am. I've been ordained since 2009 or something. I don't know, maybe even before then, 2007. I don't remember. But
the chapter in the book, Peter, by Angela Lee actually talks about this issue and links them.
Right.
It's actually one of the best lines in Beth Allison Barr's The Making of Biblical Womanhood. She makes the comment that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing Christians that oppression is godly, that God ordained some people simply because of their sex or skin color or both as belonging under the power of other people, that women's subordination is central to the gospel of Christ. And, basically that, there's this, one of the great heresies is that some people are not worth the same as others and should be treated differently. So read Angela Lee's chapter in the book, and you'll you did even when you were interviewing Neil Thompson recently, you made the comment that you'd never heard people linking the two, the argument against women's ordination with the argument for slavery. There were papers presented to the Women's Ordination Study, or the TOSC,
Theology.
Anyway, whatever it was, Theology of Ordination Study Committee. There were papers presented to that committee that made the case for slavery. That shows the lengths we will go to defend ourselves against nonsense.
Yes.
To try and build a case for nonsense, to try and defend our traditions. and why that isn't called out and just get called for the heresy that it is. And it should have been in that committee, but it wasn't.
Yeah.
And that should have been the end of the committee, because we should have realized that if we're going to subordinate women, we've got to subordinate people of color, and we will be back to slavery before we. And I'm not trying to make a slippery slope argument. What I'm trying to make here is an argument that we have two ways of looking at the world. One of them is that we lift people up, and one of them is that, and I'm talking about our faith from a faith perspective, one of them is that it lifts people up, and one of them is that it pushes people down. And so we have to make that choice. And so,
Nathan, I must say this, because you brought something beautifully together. And out of my tradition as a Black Adventist Christian, I remember after a four and a half hour ordination interview, they asked me, is there a question you want to ask us? And this was the Southern California Conference, and my question was, why haven't you ordained women? And their answer at the time, Larry Cavanis was the president, said no women have stayed long enough. They always transferred out before the ordination track. And they asked, why did you ask that? I said, well, I believe that Black people suffered longer because white people took a privilege that they wouldn't allow Blacks to have. And I don't want to take a privilege that would be denied a woman. And
wow.
And so that was my stand then.
Yeah.
And in the end, I found out that when women stayed, they had commissioned them, and I confronted and said, "You told me a lie. I didn't talk about commissioning." So, but the Pacific Union has got on board, and some other unions, and this is a union level decision. By the time someone gets to the general conference, they've been ordained. The divisions don't ordain anyone. Unions do.
Yeah.
And unions are ordaining women.
Yeah. And the other, ultimately, and this is where I was going to wrap it up, Peter, is in the epigraph of the book.
Hey, I wrap it up, not you.
You asked for our final comments. That's where I'm getting to. In the epigraph of the book, we've got some quotes from some good people, 3 prophets, James Baldwin, James Cone, and Isaiah. And this is one reason why these questions and both of these topics that we're mingling at this point. The quote from James Cone: "If God had chosen as his holy nation the Egyptian slave masters instead of the Israelite slaves, a completely different kind of God would have been revealed."
Wow. Can you just read that again?
If God had chosen as his holy nation the Egyptian slave masters instead of the Israelite slaves, a completely different kind of God would have been revealed.
Mm.
And so when we recognize that some of these other artificial subordinations that we impose on each other reflect a different understanding of God. It comes down to how you understand God. Yeah. And if you actually look at the fruits of our faith, on times that's pretty scary about what it says about what we believe about God. Mm. And so we are called to reclaim a vision of God that is inclusive, that is, positive, that is hopeful, that believes, to get back to the reference we made to Hans Gutierrez's piece, that actually believes in each individual as a human being created in the image of God, then that's a pretty significant thing. Mm. And the last part of the epigraph is the quote from Isaiah chapter 1, which simply says, "Learn to do good and seek justice." And so this idea of learning, I take that kind of seriously, that if we want to do good in the world, it's something we need to invest in, that we need to turn our attention to, that we need to practice, by doing it again and again and again, you get better at it, like learning to play the guitar. Yes. That we practice our faith by doing it, and we practice it by practical things, by stepping into the work of anti-racism in the world, by practicing equality in the ways that we are able to influence those things. That it kind of is a bit. We've talked about loops. There's a loop here that it reflects our understanding of God, but in time it also shapes our understanding of God. And so if we continue to subordination, a loaded term within play on words within that of subordination, lesser ordination, we are creating ourselves a false image of God. And then you can start getting into false images of that we get people to worship, and we're all the way to Revelation 13 really quick, which should make Adventists pretty jumpy. And so at the heart of our theology, we are called to, we need to get back to, the God who called the slaves rather than the slave masters, and then that changes everything about how we live and act and think in the world.
Yes, some great things you said in there.
I'm bursting inside with joy. This is
with both of you guys in the last half hour, I thought, boy, I'm going to have to write some of that down. There's been some gems in there. One of the things that I think Adventists struggle with is a kind of a PR problem with the rest of the world. I'm just going to mute your mic for a second there, Nathan. It's just making a funny sound. One of the issues that Adventism has is this PR problem with the rest of the world. They tend to want to bring about change and bring about social justice. People within Adventism are wanting to do that, but they don't realize that that's hindered in a way because of some of the quirky Adventist beliefs and doctrines. And one of them is the investigative judgment. And I was talking to probably 7 or 8 never been Adventists before. They've only ever heard of Adventism through me and a little social group that we're kind of connected to. And they were all going, oh, but that whole, what happened in the 1800s and that crazy belief they've got about this coming and getting ready for Jesus to return. And if they don't get ready, they won't go to heaven. Whether they're right or wrong on their assessment wants them to have really nothing to do with it, which therefore creates a problem for you guys if you want to get this message of justice and reform out there in the world. Have you both personally found that because you identify as Adventist, that therefore people would assume that you believe in 1844, that Christ started a new phase of his ministry? Does that hinder you at all in this progress towards a more progressive Adventism for the world to see?
Again, I would say I resource it the way I tried to say, let's resource our tradition. And here's the good news about a message of pre-Advent judgment. The news is this, and now you'll hear a noise because my cuckoo clock just came on. But the good news is this: God is not one who executes judgment and then goes to investigate. The idea is not a bad idea in principle, that when God comes, his rewards are with him. In other words, God doesn't, and this is an important thing for Blacks, God's not a rush to judgment. We've gone through kangaroo court systems, right? So there are ways to resource it. Now, there are oddities that are what I would call, let me say it this way, pictures of wooden literalism that are anthropomorphic, that would be dangerous theologically for anyone to take serious as anything but idolatry if we took them as real pictures, moving from this compartment to that compartment, all that kind of stuff, right? But
which is what I'm saying is a PR issue, because that's what a lot of Adventists believe, and that's what the people in the world who you're wanting to bring about help with the justice believe.
But Peter, I'm going to tell you again, I think if you go to the average Adventist and talk to them about this, they wouldn't even know how to articulate what you're talking about in America.
But these are non-Adventists I'm talking about. And they think that that's what you think, and you're saying that you don't think that, and the people that are Adventists don't even know that they don't think that.
But I would say it the way I said it. Do you want to see a judge that rules before he looks at your case?
No.
In other words, if that's the most basic, and that I think that speaks to people, right? that we have a general understanding that God's not going to execute judgment without saying, hey, this is. Now, the idea that God has to go searching and how an omniscient deity searches. Again, these are what I would call pictures that help us to think about the justice of God. And if we take them too literally, we get into the same problem of any anthropomorphic picture. Theology is a dance between apophaticism and anthropomorphism. We say, God is like a father. But if I start thinking about everything about my dad too literally and putting that on God, so I say, well, but not exactly like that. That's the apophatic. The anthropomorphic is using. So this kind of move of an analog is important. And I think it's important just to remind people that it's anything we say about God is going to be weighted down with certain anthropomorphic images that we ought to think as analogs more than anything else.
And I think, I was fifth generation Adventist, I understand the nuance of what you're saying very, very well for me personally. I guess I'm talking again to that PR issue. The two, if you go knocking on the door to help people, knocking on the door metaphorically to help people as a social justice person desiring to help with change in the community, generally speaking, they'll think two things. What is this kooky church coming to me for? What are they offering help for? And then the second thing they say is, what do they really want? What are you really selling me? So I'm just identifying that if the church is to bring about some positive change to the community with regards to race and racism, to be taken seriously, what do you think you could do to change that view that the world has of Adventism?
So keep
Because
in
people
mind.
speak to me a lot more openly now that I've left. So I suddenly have a different view of how Adventism is perceived in the community. People would never say to me before, they'll say, now, man, we used to think you were the biggest kooky bunch of people. And now I can tell you that I still think that, but I couldn't tell you then.
No, so Peter, I want to be clear. I'm speaking from an American context. You have to remember, in the cabinet of a presidency was the Seventh-day Adventist. The reality is, and I think this might be unique to America because of how many Black Adventist Christians are actually just in the world, right? They engage in the world. So there are.
Interesting.
In other words, there are those kind of smaller communities that the evangelical pockets in America that know the strange Adventist engagement. I think the majority of people don't know anything, period. So when they hear this, they're like, oh, I think, yeah, those are Christians that go to church on Saturday. Oh, I didn't know they were in that. I'm just telling you from my context.
Yeah, okay. So they don't think that Adventism is a bit weird and a bit cultish.
Not there. There's an older generation that does. There's a younger generation that when they think of it, they think of Take Six. They think of Brian McKnight. They think of
Prince.
and they think of Ben Carson. And then they say, this man supported Trump. I mean, that's worse than anything they know about doctrine for us. They don't know anything about doctrine. So what I'm trying to say is, I do know that because I have floated in different arenas.
Right.
But I'm telling you over here, that's a smaller and smaller arena. And that's to get over that hump. It's very, it's not the norm, I would say.
Right. And again, by getting this book into people's hands, you're actually demonstrating a lot of normality and quite insightful articulation of the topic. So that will help change people's views as well.
Create a new narrative.
Yeah.
It creates a new narrative.
Do you personally, like, how confident are you that something supernatural happened October 22, 1844?
The formulation of that is, to me, the question is, do I believe anything is happening supernatural? Or I might ask, is anything natural? right? That's the way I think theologically, right? So I would just say, listen, God works with mistakes and turns them into good. Or else God's creative process can look very evil. If I'm a theistic evolutionist, I might say, why did God use this process? That's the same thing that the Israelites were saying when they were in captivity in Babylon, and the prophets were saying, that's the process God used, right? So I think that the framing presupposes a kind of modernistic understanding of the natural and the supernatural. And I just don't think that the younger generation even engages in the conversation that way. And so a part of theology is how do we reconstruct and reconstitute the way we think, imagine, and articulate the ways of God in the world. You may think I'm skating around the question, and I'm not. I'm really trying to kind of give an articulation of the ways in which I hear students talking. And those old formulas, they would just say, hey, I made a mistake in my life, and I thought God was actually there to make this happen, right?
So even if the assumption that something supernatural happened that night, whether it did or it didn't, they're not interested in that. They're more interested in the providential outcomes of belief than whether something occurred or not.
Yeah, because many of them wouldn't even see anything as being supernatural. They would see, or they conflate that this world, is this world natural or is it supernatural? Your being here, is that just a part of nature or is it a divine act? Right? They tease those out in closer and more nuanced ways than the older generation does. And I think that forces us to ask questions about, does God create through a process that's naturally, or is everything we call nature a very supernatural act? That's a different conversation. Am I muddying it up enough?
No, I appreciate your answer. And Nathan, do you have a nuanced answer in reply to that question as well?
Any movement that traces its beginning to an event we colloquially consider the Great Disappointment should be one with profound humility. And that should be one of the defining markers of us as a church. Theologically, communally, practically, we should be humble about what we know and profoundly humble about what we don't know. On this particular question, which is a bit of a gotcha question in this particular context, simply those people who get overly excited.
It's not a gotcha question. It's it's how I like to gauge how people secure they feel in their belief as opposed to their position in the church if they're employed by the church.
Yeah. I think people that get too overly excited about this topic, positively or negatively, are taking it too literally. So the people who reject it do so because they take it literally. The people who accept it do so because they take it literally. And we get hung on a particular moment. I mean, significant things happened, that came out of the experience of our church pioneers at that time. And the reality is that the message of judgment is good news throughout the Bible. Particularly, and one of the challenges that judgment is God setting wrongs right. That fits so much with what we're talking about in justice and racial justice and so many other justice issues that we talk about in our world. So, when we're talking, whether it's the three angels' messages, whether it's the Psalms, whether it's, so many other places in between, we need to learn the biblical cry of justice, the good news of justice, of judgment, because judgment is God's justice, working to set the world right. That's why a book like the one we're talking about today matters, because it is in accord with God's intention for what humanity ought to be. It's why we celebrate when we see great crowds of people from every nation, tribe, language, and people marching down the streets in the common cause of humanity. That's why we can, that we are people of justice, following God of justice. That's what, again, it gets back to what we believe about God. God picks the least of these. God picks the slaves rather than the slave masters, and with this promise that all wrongs will be set right. And so, when we start to understand that in that way, then, if it means that God is judging the world, investigating, judging the world at the moment, that's actually really good news. And, we should be, and then that will inform how we live, that we seek to live in accord with the principles of the kingdom of God, with God's justice in mind. And, so you asked, before we started, you were trying to describe me as an Adventist apologist. And I'm an Adventist apologist in that I spend a lot of time apologizing for the church. But also that I, and to me, that's humility. That's the profound humility of our 1844 message is one of profound humility. We were wrong and we've got it wrong many times since. And then, but it's also, I don't really get excited about Adventism as much of it as I experience in the world today, but I'm incredibly excited about the possibilities. And I think this book that we've worked on, this project, is one about those possibilities. And those possibilities are grounded in the belief that God is judge and that God is just. And that changes, getting back to that quote about Ellen White, that this is, racism, racial prejudice, casteism, poverty. We are appointed by our God to overthrow them in the world. Without that, all this other stuff doesn't matter much. This actually changes things, and that's what we're called to be.
I get that, and I understand that, and I think again part of what I was chatting about was the perception that others have of that when they see the conflict to struggle with answering questions like that. For like liberation and justice has got to be a personal thing as well. And it's such a freeing thing for me to say, I don't believe Ellen White was a prophet. I don't believe anything happened in 1844. I can say that, and I can then say, but boy, this is a brilliant book. And I think the conversation is amazing. And the rest of the world, the people looking in, they just want to hear this stuff. You're right. They want to get on with their lives. They want to, enjoy what the teachings of Jesus, community, good Christian community, the values that Christian community upholds. They're just seeing a strange dichotomy when they look at the Adventists struggling to answer some of these quirky beliefs.
Peter, I don't want to give the impression that I'm trying to be a careful Adventist apologist. Let me be very candid. Do I think that God wasn't investigating before? I mean, this is the language of investigation is impoverished. If God knows all, God always knows all. God doesn't not know until 1844. Come on, let's not be.
Otherwise, what was the gospel before 1844?
Exactly. But on the other hand, I want to be as clear. Do those same people you talk to believe a snake was talking in a garden? In other words, do they understand that theological symbols are exactly that? And the question we have to ask is, to what degree do we resource them for their good? These symbols, in fact, are also going to be, they're going to have some brokenness. And that's what I think, that's the fair discussion, right? That's the discussion of, I remember when I was flying to Jordan to look at some archaeology digs, and they said, the pilot said, look over, that's the island of Patmos. I looked down and the first thing came to my mind, you could dig till you get to the core of the earth and you won't find the skeletons of those bones that of the beast that John said he saw. Of course not.
It's metaphor, symbol, analogy.
There you go. And I think that's the best you can do with these other kind of narrative metaphors in the founding of a movement.
And I think when the investigative judgment is looked through an analogous eye, it suddenly makes a lot more interesting sense than whether something happened or not, literally. Exactly. And I encourage people to do that. It's actually fascinating to reread a lot of that from 1844 to 1851 era, that 7-year era, as metaphor. It's actually fascinating, and maybe in a few hundred years, people will look back on that time significantly as a metaphor, and the world needed what that metaphor stood for at the time. And again, I'm not saying these things to challenge or to create a tension in any way. I'm just saying that I'm seeing people out in the world wanting to embrace Adventism and a lot of the good things that Adventists stand for, but always feeling like they feel a bit awkward about it. And these are the topics. So they're watching. I know these friends are all in.
But I would tell them,
and they enjoy hearing this kind of conversation.
I would tell them you don't have to embrace Adventism. I would tell them what Mervyn Warren at Oakwood College taught us. He said, a lot of people think that when the shaking comes, everyone will be shaken out of the church who don't hold on to the pillars of Sabbath, sanctuary, spirit of prophecy. He goes, when the shaking comes, everyone will be shaken out who holds on to anything but Christ. I tell them, walk with Christ. Wherever that leads you, that will be the place where you will grow. And it may lead you somewhere else. Walk with Christ. And to the degree you find a fellowship of Adventist Christians who are walking with Christ and you feel comfortable, walk with them. And I think that we, that's the way we all have narratives. We start in the heritages and families, and we just have to say, hey, I have a family and I'm gonna walk with my family. If it gets too dysfunctional, I have cousins.
Yeah. And I think that's very true, and that's how it should be. I think what I'm alluding to is that when an Adventist says it, it's not that they're deciding to be an Adventist or not. What the Adventist says and produces is tainted in their eyes because of this other stuff. And again, and I won't labor that thought. It's kind of just something that I think, because we're having this conversation, and these friends that I know are watching even today, they appreciate the honesty and the articulation and the grappling with stuff, and that will then make them, value this read more. And then people that read it also will have their ideas changed and shifted, I think, as well. Because the Adventist system, the way it's just set up as a movement, it can disseminate change quite rapidly because it's quite a well-structured system. It's a well-oiled machine in many ways. So if it got its sights on doing something productive, it could happen really fast. It could happen very effectively. And I think in many ways that's what frustrates some of the more progressive Adventists, is that here's this system that could really do that, but it's spending thousands, millions of dollars on running off 1 billion copies of Great Controversy. And so I think that's what can frustrate some of the more progressives. But I think
those who are frustrated, I think you have to ask, and how's that working for them?
Yeah, exactly. And then what again, and not to I'm not saying this to be kind to Nathan, but what I like about what Nathan does is he doesn't just say it or sit back frustrated, he does stuff. And so
no, I didn't mean those who are complaining. I'm saying, how do you think a billion great controversies are working for them?
oh, I see what you mean. Yes.
No,
Oh, and
they should not worry. They should just
yeah,
go where things are working.
yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. And that
I'm too excited. It's late at night, Nathan. So you say I'm one of those guys. When I get sleepy, I talk more.
and I love it. I love that you do. And you've both really contributed some incredible gems today. And I really value you taking the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
And I highly recommend that everyone goes out and buys this book. And even if you don't read it, if you think, oh, that's beyond me, I don't want to get involved, just buy it, and you're helping the cause by just, getting it moving. So, okay, last words. Nathan, Maury, quick sentence if you want to just wrap it up, and we will say farewell.
You were trying to
Thank you for your ministry.
Sorry, you just froze there for a second.
So we have problems. Yes, we were trying to identify challenges earlier, and is wrapping up conversations. So I'm happy to consider it done. Thank you, Peter. We appreciate
my theory.
We appreciate
your
support.
Maury. Thank you, Nathan. My pleasure. And just a quick last comment.
Nathan. I just want to say thank you to you all. That's all.
Thank you, Maury. Thank you, Nathan. And Matthew Coltman was watching today. As you know, he and I had the longest SDA conversation on record. So you'll be pleased, Nathan, to know that we're not even close to that. 4.5 hours, I think it was, or 4:45. But his interview is also the most viewed of any interview I've done on SDAQ&A. So there's a method to the madness. Hey, just a quick reminder, I was going to be interviewing Jim Zeiderveld. We had some technical issues last Tuesday. We were going to do it this Tuesday. It's going to be Thursday now. So we've just got some time issues. So Thursday next week, we'll be having that interview. Thank you for always standing up for justice. This is the way. That's a great note to end it on. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Until we meet again. See you later.
Blessings.